Mr. Garrity and the Graves brought back actor John Dehner and a host of other TZ veterans for their final trips through the fifth dimension in a humor-leaning script by Rod Serling. Could the charm of its star and intriguing setup lead us to a rare, successfully comedic installment of the series? In 1890, Jared Garrity, a traveling salesman, arrives in a small town called Happiness, Arizona. The little village has seen more than its fair share of violence and has been renamed several times over the years. Somewhat recently, they employed a morally upright sheriff, constructed a jail and gallows, and began enforcing the law. Garrity is filled in on Happiness's history by the local bartender Jensen. The salesman learns the nearby Boot Hill Cemetery contains the bodies of 128 individuals. All except one, the town drunk's corpulent wife, died by gunfire. Garrity mentions that his services could be of use in a place like this.
I bring back the dead.
When a man driving a carriage strikes and kills a stray dog, Garrity proves his claims by resurrecting it. The townspeople are astonished by the salesman's gift, calling it the devil's work. But Jared quells their fears by saying his skills are applied scientific principles acquired in the Himalayan mountains. The gathered residents of Happiness are delighted to hear Garrity offer to bring back their loved ones. At midnight, the dead will return. That evening, Jared walks into the saloon and says the deed is done. The town's deceased will soon walk among them. The first seen in the distance is the bartender's brother, John. As the reality of the situation begins to dawn on the townsfolk, they start to have second thoughts on once again seeing their dearly departed. Ted Post was able to adapt a better Serling script than his last effort, Probe 7 Over and Out, and produced one of the more fun, lighthearted episodes of the fifth season that still succeeds in its morbid main idea. Setting this tale in the Old West gave Post room to try out some eye-catching shots mixed in with simple character-based comedic timing. In the same episode, we get eerie visuals like these great angles of Jensen's brother walking into town, and also play up the humor with sight gags that actually land. It's an entertaining amalgam put together from behind the camera. Rod is credited with the teleplay here, based on a story by Mike Korologos. In Martin Graham Jr.'s book, The Twilight Zone, Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic, we get more details about how this tale came into Serling's purview. Originally, a recounting of the story was printed in an old tour guide called American Guide series that Korologos found. It was known as the Alta Stranger, and concerned a man entering the town of Alta, Utah in the Old West era, claiming he was going to resurrect the town's many deceased citizens. Korologos wrote an article about the story that Serling saw while in the area. The show was soon in touch with a sports writer by trade, and he sold his article to be adapted by Rod. It is an excellent premise that Serling rightly jumped on. His angle on the original story proved to be a worthwhile 25-minute exhibition. In my opinion, Mr. Garrity and the Graves works so well because of its cast of highly enjoyable characters. The humor doesn't come from lame jokes or hacky sitcom-type comedy. It comes from the characters themselves. John Dehner as Garrity is such a smooth customer. He's almost got a Bugs Bunny thing going on, influencing the growing madness around him with a knowing smirk. Stanley Adams as Jensen, with his shaved head and bulging eyes, made for great reaction shots. I love when he waxes poetic about Happiness's newfound peace.
It's kind of like the sun coming over a dark cloud and shining on you with its warm rays of beneficence. I do a little preaching on the side, too.
The sheriff that Jensen builds up is also hilarious. Norman Leovitt's physical timing and way of speaking was on point.
Now, some men depend on this all the time when they should be using the old bean.
Percy Helton as Lapham looks like a short version of a pre-death Hatbox ghost, but brings a believable nervous energy to the ensemble. Finally, J. Pat O'Malley as the town drunk, Gooberman, provides more blatant yucks to the episode. Plus, his wife's name is Zelda.
My dear wife, Zelda, rest the soul.
These actors were all perfectly cast and played their roles well. Why couldn't this be the comedy that Serling pitched as a series? An Old West town full of comedic archetypes encounter a new perceived supernatural event every episode. Garrity would be forced to stick around to help defend them. For the right price, of course. I'd watch that. This was my favorite TZ part John Dehner played, and all three of his own episodes were good ones. Stanley Adams was much funnier in this than in his first outing, Once Upon a Time. J. Pat O'Malley made his final of 4 appearances, Percy Helton was given his second and last credit, and the same went for John Mitchum. There are quite a few uncredited performances, but one that deserves special recognition is Robert McCord. McCord appeared in 32 episodes across all 5 seasons of the series. This was his last. Of those 32 installments, only 2 were credited. If you're ever going back to watch the full series, it'd be fun to try and spot this face in as many shows as you can. Desperate to send his brother back to the grave, Jensen pays Garrity $750 to undo his resurrection. It's obvious that he killed John for being a lifelong thief, and the reanimated corpse disappears in the street. Soon the whole town approaches Jared with similar requests. Guberman's wife broke his arm 6 times. The sheriff shot an infamous gunman in the back. A widow has remarried, and so on. Garrity ends up making a fortune to forego the return of the town's dead. Later, outside the cemetery, the salesman calls over the dog he resurrected and reconvenes with its killer, who was dressed up as Jensen's brother. Their scheme has yielded its greatest fruits yet. Garrity waves goodbye to the town's deceased and rides off. But after he leaves, the dead really do rise and proclaim their revenge on the residents of Happiness. I love the ending featuring the town's expired climbing out of their graves. It looks great and is a predictable but perfect twist. There is a feeling of humor to their resurrection, but it's still creepy imagery. Having all the characters that the townspeople were speaking about given their own little moment was an outstanding stroke. The only thing I didn't like were the really weird zooms done in post-production. The frame constantly moving like that nearly took me out of it. They must have ran out of time to get full coverage of the scene. Garrity's con man ways were explained at the end. All but one. It's never discussed how the salesman's friend disappeared into thin air while dressed as Jensen's brother. Just a throwaway line about mirrors or something would have been enough. I also wish the dead went after Garrity as a comeuppance for fooling Happiness and taking their money. They could have made that sequence a little more grisly with Jared's con coming to a permanent finish. The townsfolk weren't all innocent, but sending a lot of those reanimated citizens back to the small village seemed a touch undeserved. Despite those small reservations, I'll give Mr. Garrity and the Graves my full endorsement. It's funny without being forced, it has a terrific premise in the ideal setting, and it has a real-world inspiration. Go on and follow Garrity's wagon to his next graveyard, because fortune favors the fatal in the Twilight Zone.